So I want to talk a little bit about selection paths and channels and how they can be used creatively. See if I can share my Photoshop screen. Here we go. That's right. It's the rubber ducky. Anyways, um, we are familiar with all these selection tools, so we already know the best one to use is going to be not that one, but get to it, the magic wand tool. We click once in the background, correct? Let me make that a little bigger by double clicking the hand tool. So we take the magic wand tool, click once in the white, so it selects all of the white, and then we inverse that selection to go to the foreground element. So a lot of times you go back and forth between foreground and background elements that way by going to the select menu and hitting inverse. Also, you can save selection paths. So if we select that background, for instance, and we go over to the select menu and come down to save selection, and before we do that, before we go to save selection under the select menu with a selection already in front of us, let's go over and take a look where it's going to put it. It's going to put it over here in your layers. Right next to your layers palette is your channels palette. Let's click and make that active. Now again, in my workspace up in here under window and workspace, I'm using essentials. And if yours, here it is, and if yours doesn't look exactly like mine, you can come down here to reset essentials and we'll be on the same page, or at least the same workspace and workshop. Anyways, so layers, they grow your file exponentially. The more layers you have, the bigger your file size. Channels, they do as well, but not so much. And what they're used for, as we talked about before, is color information, in this case RGB, but also selection paths. So if I've got that background selected, we can tell by the marching ants that I have, and I go up to the select menu, and I go to save selection. It's going to ask me what to call it. Not only am I going to be lazy and not give it a name, as my usual manner is, but I want you to see what's going to happen when I don't give it a name. I'm going to click OK. And over here we can see that it's created a selection, and it's called Alpha 1. By default, it'll call it Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Alpha 3, unless you give it names. So you should get into a good name and call it background or something like that. Whenever you click on a channel to isolate it, the various colors, in this case the selection path, double click the RGB or the CMYK to get back to your full color image. Again, your channels, very different than layers. I'm going to wrap your brain around channels right now. So under my channels, if I go to load that up in my layers, I'm going to select this duck and have that layer selected. I'm going to deselect. We can see there's marching ants, so Command D or Control D. So no more marching ants, no more selection. Deselect. And then I'm going to go up to the select menu and come down to load selection. Now that won't be available if I haven't saved a selection. And I'll click go ahead and there we go, Alpha 1. And when I click OK, you can see that it selected that background. And if we look at our channels and analyze it, everything that's white is being selected, everything that's black is not being selected. Now, I believe that's probably a mask instead of a let's see what it says here. If I go and double click on it, sure, it's masked areas. That's what it's doing, and which is the exact opposite of selected areas. So let's just double click on that and put it over to selected areas. Yours may vary, but I can click on that. Now we can see the exact opposites happening there. So I'm going to go back to the RGB and then deselect and load that selection. And when I do select, load selection, Alpha 1, because it's been defined as a selection and not a mask, it's going to load that same thing. So a mask and a selection are exact opposites. It's like foreground, background. And remember that the only things that are affected are those things that are selected. And once all of this logic starts to kick in, a whole world of compositing opens up for you. As an example, remember this is just the eyeball's not turned on, so it's just an invisible representation of your selection path. What's black is selected 100%. What's white's not selected at all. Now, if we look at that, and again, very different than layers over here. We're in our channels. We're in one layer. So whatever we do is going to be destructive on that layer. So let's go back to our channels. I can take that channel and I can load it up. Now, one way to load up a channel, or a layer for that matter, is anytime you have something that just has pixels and no pixels, you can just Command or Control, click on it, and that will load up the selection. I'm going to Command D, deselect, no more marching ants, And I could either go to the select menu and come down to load selection and load that selection, alpha 1. Now marching against in that background, Command D, deselect. Or I could just very quickly Command or Control click just on the layer itself. A little faster, right? Than having to go to the select menu and come down to load selection and pick the selection you want to load. And that's true with layers as well. If you have a transparency and you have pixels on a layer, all you have to do is Command or Control click on that to load it up. So if I click on that, it's going to load up that selection. So I'm going to Command D, deselect. Now, just wrapping our brains around this for a second. What's dark is, what's black there is going to be loaded 100% and affected. What's white isn't. And we know we can inverse under the select menu to change those relationships once we make a selection. Now, you've probably in the layers palette non-destructively gone over here to the little twirly on the side and probably created a new layer or duplicated layer. That's something that we do a lot, very freeing thing. So it's non-destructive a lot of times. So the same thing happens in channels. You can actually go to the little disclosure on the right-hand side there, and you can click and you can actually create a new channel, duplicate channel. I don't have anything selected there, but and what I want to do is create a new channel. And it's going to ask me to call it something, and I'll call it background. Although I already have that defined. So it's an empty layer. If I load that up, everything's going to be affected. Everything's white. It's going to be affected. If I load that up, only the background's going to be affected because it's black. So again, just Control or Command clicking on it to show you that. Marching ants, background selected. Click on this one. Warning, no pixels are selected. So it's got all white and there's no black in it. So nothing's going to be selected. So that idea there, so if I take a rectangle, for instance, and just draw into that, I'm active in that layer, in that channel, by the way. Again, very different than layers. I'm active in that channel. And I don't have the eyeball turned on either. But if I just make a rectangle, oops, excuse me, and then go over to my, let's see here, gradient tool. It works with light and dark values. Is it going to let me fill it? Got to turn the eyeball on maybe first, and then fill it. And you can see over here, it's black to white. Channels only work with black and white values. And turn the eyeball back off. I don't really want to see it. But now watch what happens if I Command click or go to, it's called background. If I go to select, load selection, background, or if I better yet, just Control or Command click on it, see what just happened there. So if I go back to my layers palette and I've got that selected and I hit something like my backspace or my delete key, let's see if it's going to let me do that. Oh, I've got to unlock it first maybe. You can see what's happening there is that transition. And if and I'm going to undo this in just a second, but if I go back to my channels, what's black is selected 100%. What's white's not affected at all. And what is light gray transitions away. So let's take that destructive thing we just did to that layer. Let's Command Z, put it back very quickly. And also, if you look at your selection path when you load those things up, it can't show you those transparencies. So it does its best to try to figure out what it's going to look like. Now, there's no transparencies in the top one. It's just all black and white. So if I Control or Command click and load that one, you can see it's a hard edge. So knowing that, I'm going to go ahead and take that and select all, Command A and hit delete so I can clean it all up. Actually, when I hit delete, it replaces it with your background color over here. So I'm going to reverse that to white. And with that selected, now hit delete. And it's going to replace it with the background color. And it's just an empty layer with nothing in it. So, and again, I don't need to see it. But what I do need to do is just kind of, and I'm going to go back to my RGB so we can see our layer that's intact still. I'm going to start to manipulate that background. Now I'm going to do that by isolating the duck or at least the background by loading this selection into this empty background. So I'll show you what I mean. I got the RGB selected, and what I want to do is manipulate this background and then load it up as a selection. So I select the background, and then I Control or Command click alpha 1, which is the actual background. You see the marching ants. I'm going to deselect and do that again a different way. I could go up to the select menu, correct? Up in here and click, and then come down to load selection, and then go to background and do it that way too. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Alpha 1's what I wanted to load. So if I, because I'm active in the background, so if I go up to select menu, come down to load selection, and instead of background, I want to load Alpha 1 into background. So see, now I've got that background selected. So anything I do in that background is going to be affected 100%. I'll take my brush for here. Instance, brushes work with foreground color. I'll lower the size of it a little bit and make it hard edged. And see, anything I do up in here, I can't touch that duck. I can't touch it at all. I'm painting here with just a foreground color, black. And that's because it's isolated with that selection I loaded up before it. So I'm going to undo that, Command Z. And instead of using that tool, the paintbrush tool, to paint back in there, instead I'm going to use the gradient tool. And the gradient tool works with foreground, background color, black and white. So over here, I'm going to hold my shift key down so the proportions are straight up and down and not off to the side. That shift key will constrain the proportions to straight down. And I'll play a little bit. And I'm just going to try it again until I get something I'm satisfied with. Not too bad. So up in here, it's going to be affected 100%. That's my background, the black that I just painted. Down here, it's not going to be affected at all. And because I loaded this selection, this background in here before I started painting this selection, the duck's protected 100% because only the background's being affected right now by that gradient. So let's do this. Let's go back to our RGB. Remember our layers over here, our intact image. And let's load up this new selection. And instead of going to the long way of select and then coming down to load selection and then picking, background, instead of doing it that way, I'm just going to get into this really good workflow habit of just command or control clicking and then selecting it. And again, it can't show you the transparencies, but you can tell from the thumbnail what's going to happen. Everything at black at the top is going to be affected 100%. Everything at the bottom is not going to be affected at all. And so let's do something. We could go paste a picture into that, but instead let's just fill it with a pattern. So we'll go up to File, Edit, Fill, and I'm just going to use some of the patterns I already have. And then under Contents, I'll go to Pattern. And I just happened to download a flower earlier that was against a transparent background. And I'm not covering patterns right now, but I like these scripted patterns. They're some of my favorite. And my pattern du jour is the spiral, so I'm going to try that one. And it's going to show me what it's going to look like. And maybe I'll play with the scales as big as it's going to be. Spacing, reduce that a little bit, make them a little tighter together. And let's see here, ring spacing. There we go. Something like that. I'll fill that at the top. And so if I click OK, oop, so that was the wrong resolution, that pattern. I have to go back and redefine that pattern a lot smaller, no? Anyways, you get the idea what happened. I just filled the image. The only things that are affected, this is my layers. These are selections. So that's the important distinction. The only thing that was affected were those things that were loaded up. And so as it transitions from dark to light, it doesn't get affected at all. Now, just to complicate things, and we're looking at, now I've destroyed that layer, by the way. I would have duplicated it first and had a little safety down there with the eyeball turned off, so that didn't happen, but this is gone forever right now. So we go to the channels again, and now we can manipulate this again. Now, what happens if I want to manipulate the bottom? If I want to get the bottom a different pattern or a different image to paste in there that kind of seamlessly composites itself going up to the top. Something like that goes up to the top here. So it starts down in here and then fades away and blends into this image. Well, all I have to do, you would think, is if I go to this one and just invert it, I'm going to deselect here. If I just invert it, and that's an easy one, that's under Image and then Adjustments and Invert, almost always Command or Control I. Now watch what happens. All the black at the top is going to turn white. All the white at the bottom is going to turn black. And all the grays are going to turn exactly the opposite value. If it was 60%, it's going to be 40%. Meaning if I paste that in there, it's going to completely blend into that other image perfectly. Because before, where it was 40%, it's 60%, and as it goes down, it blends because I inverted it. So pixel for pixel, it has to match up. Now the problem with that is the ducks become black. So I'm gonna have to Command Z, undo that first, getting back to my original selection. And I need to protect that duck. So to protect the duck over here, when I invert it and the values change in the background, I just need to load that selection again, that background selection. Horrible names. This should have been called background instead of alpha 1. Anyways, easy way is Command or Control. I'm holding down, click, background's loaded. Now, if I've got that background loaded, I'm active in this channel. You usually don't see these channels either, these selection paths. I'm only turning it on to really kind of manipulate it creatively. But if I take that bottom one down there and again go to Image, Adjustments, or Command I, Control I, Invert. Now, because I loaded that background only, that was the only thing that could be affected, the duck was protected. Now let's go back to our RGB and see what happens when we load that selection path. I'm going to Command D, deselect, and then I'm going to Command Control on a PC, select that new background. And again, you can kind of get an idea of what's happening. In black, down here at the bottom, it's going to be affected 100%. Because we loaded that alpha channel in here first, it was protected. The duck wasn't affected by that invert command. And as it gradates away, it can't show you the transparencies, but as it goes into white, nothing will be happening at all at the very top. And the duck itself is white, so that nothing will be happening down there at all either. So let's try that. Before we try to pattern, let's try a different pattern. So if we go to Fill, Edit, Fill, and then Pattern would be kind of anticlimactic. It get the same pattern. And this new version doesn't really have water. That's kind of cool. Guess what? They have new patterns with the newest version of Photoshop. This is all new to me. I'll pick this one and see what happens. And what have I got? Script. I'll turn that off and just let it rip and see what happens. Not too bad. But you can see what's happening here is I'm creatively manipulating the channels in order to kind of determine what's going to be composited. And then I can invert that so that I can have it go the other way and seamlessly blend into the next object. Now that may be a lot to wrap your brain around. And again, if I go back to my layers palette over here, where I've been in channels a lot, and usually you just turn the eyeballs on to manipulate them. And then you go back to your RGB or CMYK so you can continue to work on your layers. And then you go back to your layers. So if I look at my layers now, it's been pretty beat up. And I can no longer use the magic wand tool to select that duck. If I click once in that background is no longer white. So what I've got to do now is either quick select or something like that. It's not as easy to select anymore as it was on the white background. Let's see here. So taking these idea between layers and channels and what the difference is, and understanding that channels can be used creatively to load selections and protect them when you're using it as a mask, but also when you're doing effects on it.